Hello all. Welcome to the second part of this rewatch of Granada's adaptation of Brideshead Revisited. Episode 2, Home and Abroad, recounts the long vacation before Charles's second year in Oxford. It begins with Charles arriving at Brideshead and ends with his return to London the day before the new term starts. There are no scenes in college and barely any mention of university life. It starts with a few scenes from the end of episode 1, of Julia bringing Charles to Brideshead, and of Charles pushing Sebastian through the hothouses. Then there is a scene with the two of them by the fountain, with Charles sketching and talking about architecture. There is a montage of Charles propelling Sebastian's wheelchair across summer lawns. They find some oils, and Sebastian encourages Charles to paint some murals in the garden room. They go down into the cellars with Wilcox and look at all the wine. They have bottles brought up from every bin, and Charles reads a book on wine tasting to give their nightly drunkenness a veneer of cultural education. As the weeks go by, Sebastian's foot recovers, and he is no longer a prisoner of his chair. Their peace is disturbed by the annual agricultural fair. Charles and Sebastian stay out of the way of the judges and dignitaries, but the occasion does bring about Charles's first meetings with Sebastian's elder brother, Lord Brideshead, and youngest sister, Cordelia. The four of them have dinner together that evening, after which Sebastian decides that Charles had better come to Venice with him. The second half of the episode is set entirely in Venice. They stay with Sebastian's father, Alex, and Cara, the woman that he left his wife for. She and the boys spend most of their visit sightseeing, wandering over bridges and down narrow streets, through art galleries and ornate churches. Charles and Sebastian spend almost the entire episode together, parting only when they return to London and arranging to see each other immediately after their separate journeys up to Oxford the following day. In terms of what happens, of where they go and what they do, that's it. Those few brief paragraphs summarise all of the action in this episode. We're not really here for action, though, are we? We've seen this before, and we know that the magic of this series is its characters and its poetry, and that magic is found in narration and conversation. There are several themes running through this episode, and the narrative weaves back and forth from one to the other. Rather than comment on things chronologically, as we did in episode 1, I'm going to focus on each of these themes in turn. The first theme to consider is family. We learn a lot in this episode about the Flights. We already knew from before that Sebastian's parents are separated, although not divorced, of course, since Lady Marchmain is such a pious Catholic. That his elder brother is, although still in his 20s, quite like an old man. As this episode begins, though, we have yet to meet any of these people. The first mention here of other family members is down in the cellars with Wilcox.
Should have laid down the 18s and 20s by now. The ladyship says to ask Lord Brideshead, he says to ask his lordship. His lordship says to ask the lawyers. That's how we get low.
Then, on the day of the fair, Sebastian summarises them all for Charles.
So you see, we're a mixed family religiously. Brideshead and Cordelia are both fervent Catholics. He's miserable, she's bird happy. Julia and I are both semi-heathens. I'm happy. I rather think Julia isn't. Mum is popularly believed to be a saint, and Papa's excommunicated. I wouldn't know which of them were happy. Anyway, however you look at it, happiness doesn't seem to have much to do with it. And that's all I want.
Sebastian says that his brother is much the craziest of us, all twisted inside. I'm not sure I agree with that. That could be because Sebastian is just being an unreliable narrator. Or it could be because this adaptation fails to properly bring out that side of Bridie. Or it could just be that I am biased, because I like Bridie, and prefer to think of him as an eccentric rather than a tortured soul. We meet Cordelia for the first time. She is the youngest, still a schoolgirl of 12 or 13, and a marvellous performance from Phoebe Nichols. Cordelia is bright and cheerful, strong-willed and earnest, willing to forgive any fault in the ones she loves. The boys are sunbathing naked on the roof when she finds them. "Go away, Cordelia," says Sebastian. "We're not decent." "Yes, you are," she responds, as if Sebastian is decent to her by definition, whatever he might be doing. There is a nice piece of comedy in how Sebastian interacts with his two sisters.
Julie, do you think if you asked him, Wilcox might give us champagne tonight?
I hate champagne, and Mr. Ryder has already had dinner.
Mr. Ryder? Mr. Ryder? Charles drinks champagne at all hours.
I'll talk to Charles.
Charles? Charles? Mr. Ryder to you, child.
At first glance, it feels like a deliberate contrast, as if it's showing us that he treats them differently. Actually, of course, they are both younger sisters, and he is treating them just the same. He is treating them both as wrong, like all siblings everywhere. Julia is barely in this episode. Her one appearance at the very start is a repeat of something we'd already seen at the end of episode 1. None of the other episodes have bridging moments like this. I wonder if it was something contractual, if they needed to have Diana Quick in every episode. I do still feel Julia's presence here, though, even if only in foreshadowing. Listen to the words that the older Charles chooses, for example, in this piece of narration.
That night, I began to realize how little I really knew of Sebastian, and to understand why he had always sought to keep me apart from the rest of his life. He was like a friend made on board ship on the high seas. Now we had come to his home port.
Knowing what he knows, Charles the narrator, how could he speak of an ocean liner and not be thinking of Julia? And his younger self is sitting there in Brideshead Castle, which would be he and Julia's home port so many years later. Similarly, at the end of the episode, we see the storm at the Lido, with servants doing their best to carry on as normal while everyone is running for cover through the wind and rain, except for Charles and the flights. How could this not be foreshadowing for that ocean voyage to come? But there, I have been distracted by Julia, and she isn't even here. Let's move on to other flights, shall we? Charles asks if Sebastian's father has given up religion, which foreshadows much later tragedy.
Well, he's had to, in a way. He only took it up when he married Mummy. When he went off, he left it behind with the rest of us.
That sense of betrayal that we hear from Sebastian is a key moment. He is not estranged from his father and calls him a very nice man. But that childhood abandonment is the foundation for so much of what comes later. For his hunger for people who won't leave him or turn against him. Maybe that sense of abandonment is part of the bond between Charles and Sebastian. Charles's mother went off to drive an ambulance in the Great War and died there when he was very young. When we finally meet Sebastian's father, Charles finds him to be a man of many layers.
I had been full of curiosity to meet Lord Marchmain. When I did so, I was first struck by his normality, which, as I saw more of him, I found to be studied. It was as though he were conscious of a Byronic aura which he considered to be in bad taste and was at pains to suppress.
"Don't worry," says Sebastian. "He's really very sweet underneath." "He does frighten me a bit," admits Charles. "You'll soon get used to that," says Sebastian. Sebastian is used to being frightened of his father. This is another moment that lands differently today, I think, than when the book was written. Edwardian fathers were more distant and severe than is currently the fashion. Cara, Alex's mistress, explains things to Charles and to the viewers.
Do you think he loves me?
Really, Cara? You do ask the most embarrassing questions. How should I know? I assume.
He does not. But not the littlest piece.
But then why does he stay with you?
Because I protect him from Lady Marchmain. He hates her. But you can have no conception how he hates her. My friend, he's a volcano of hate. He can't breathe the same air as she. He won't set foot in England because it's her home. He can scarcely be happy with Sebastian because he's her son. But Sebastian hates her too.
Oh, no, I think you're wrong there.
He may not admit it to you. He may not admit it to himself. They're full of hate. Hate of themselves. Alex and his family. And how has she deserved all this hate? She's done nothing except to be loved by someone who was not grown up. When people hate with all that energy, it's something in themselves they're hating. Alex is hating all the illusions of boyhood. Innocence. God. Hope.
I think that the sense that Lady Marchmain doesn't deserve all the hate that she receives is an important point, especially coming from Cara, whose role in this episode is to speak out loud truths which are important. The Brideshead fandom is full of people happy to cast Lady Marchmain as the villain of this piece, and I'm pleased to see this evidence that War himself did not agree. This is not the time for a longer discussion of Lady Marchmain. We haven't even met her yet. We'll come back to this in a few months. Religion is another theme that threads through this episode. We've already covered the parts that deal directly with Sebastian's family, but there are other mentions of religion that also feel important. Mostly they relate to Charles, and his combination of curiosity about faith and also dismissal of it.
On Sundays, a neighbouring priest called to say Mass. Sebastian's faith was an enigma to me at the time, but not one that I felt particularly concerned to solve. I took it as a foible, like his teddy bear.
Such an old bore, Father Phipps. Kept me back half an hour after Mass talking about cricket.
Do you want some cold coffee?
Yes, please. It's so difficult being a Catholic.
Does he make much difference to you?
Of course. All the time.
Well, I can't say I've noticed it. Are you struggling against temptation? You don't seem to be much more virtuous than me.
My dear Charles, I'm much, much wickeder.
Well, then.
Who was it used to pray, "Oh, God, make me good, but not yet"?
I don't know, you, I should think.
Yes, I do. All the time. I wish I liked Catholics more.
They seem just like everyone else.
My dear Charles, that's exactly what they're not. Particularly in this country, where there's so few. I mean, it's not just they're a clique. Everything they think is important is different from other people. I mean, they try and cover it up, but it comes out all the time. So it's difficult for semi-heathens like Julia and me.
Charles's attitude to religion is very much that of an outsider.
As a child, I had no religion. I was taken to church weekly, and at school attended chapel daily. But as though in compensation, from the time I went to my public school, I was excused church on the holidays. The view implicit in my education was that the basic narrative of Christianity had long been exposed as a myth, and that opinion was now divided as to whether its ethical teaching was of present value, a division in which the main weight went against it. Religion was a hobby which some people professed and others did not. At the best, it was slightly ornamental. At the worst, it was the province of complexes and inhibitions, catchwords of the decade, and of the intolerance, hypocrisy, and sheer stupidity attributed to it for centuries. No one had ever suggested to me that these quaint observances expressed a coherent philosophical system and intransigent historical claims, nor, had they done so, would I have been much interested. My father did not go to church, except on family occasions, and then with derision. My mother, I think, was devout. It once seemed odd to me that she should have thought it her duty to leave my father and me and go off with an ambulance to Serbia, to die of exhaustion in the snow in Bosnia. But I later recognized some such spirit in myself. Later, too, I have come to accept claims which then, in 1923, I never troubled to examine, and to accept the supernatural as the real. But I was aware of no such needs that summer.
This last is our first evidence that the older Charles, who is narrating all of this, has since come to be a believer. Charles, the narrator, is older still than the Captain Ryder that we meet in episode 1. He tells us the story of that unexpected return to Brideshead in 1944 in the past tense. He is remembering being Captain Ryder and remembering Captain Ryder thinking back to Oxford and Venice and Sebastian and Julia. We are never told how old he is. We are never told if the faith that he has now found has brought him happiness. While we are talking of Charles, let's talk about the theme of art and beauty.
It was an aesthetic education to live within those walls. Since the days when, as a schoolboy, I used to bicycle round the neighbouring parishes rubbing brasses and photographing fonts, I had nursed a love of architecture. but my sentiments at heart were insular and medieval. This was my conversion to the Baroque.
If it was mine, says Charles of Brideshead, I couldn't live anywhere else. We'll come back to that line much later. Sebastian's attitude to beauty is entirely different and fundamentally incompatible. Back in episode 1, he picks up one of the books that Charles is studying.
Does anyone feel the same emotion for a butterfly or a flower as he feels for a cathedral or a picture? Yes, I do.
Is the dome by Banvera? Asked Charles, sketching by the fountain. It looks later. What does it matter when it was built if it's pretty? Asks Sebastian. Then, later, when discussing the beliefs of Catholicism,
I suppose they try and make you believe lots of nonsense.
Is it nonsense? I wish it were. Sometimes seems particularly sensible to me.
My dear Sebastian, you can't seriously believe it all.
Can't I?
I mean about Christmas and the star and the ox and the ass and the three kings.
Yes, I believe all that. It's a lovely idea.
You can't believe things because they're lovely ideas.
Well, I do. That's how I believe.
Bridie's attitude to art is then different in turn to either of theirs. Discussing the pressure to close the chapel, he asks Charles what he thinks of it aesthetically. Is it good art? He says, oblivious to how upset the conversation is making Cordelia. I'm not quite sure what you mean, says Charles. Oh, Bridie, says Sebastian, stop being so Jesuitical. And then, of course, there is Venice. If an English stately home was an intoxicating experience for Charles, then Venice is almost too much of a good thing.
The fortnight in Venice passed quickly and sweetly, perhaps too sweetly. It left a confused memory of fierce sunlight on the sands, of cool marble interiors, of water everywhere lapping on smooth stone, reflected in a dapple of light on painted ceilings, of a night at the Corombona Palace such as Byron might have known.
I was drowning in honey, says Charles. Let's talk about the end of a now lost age, which is another theme that this episode repeatedly returns to. We hear it first from Wilcox in the cellars.
One day we went down to the cellars with Wilcox and saw the empty bays which had once held a vast store of wine.
A lot of this old wine just wants drinking up. Should have laid down the 18s and 20s by now. That's how we get low. Oh, I know there's enough to last 10 years, but what happens then? That's what I want to know.
What then, indeed? In Venice, Sebastian's father talks about the sense that the world he grew up in feels increasingly under threat.
It's my tragedy that I abominate the English countryside. I suppose it's very wrong to inherit great responsibilities and be entirely indifferent. I'm all that the socialists would have me be, and a great stumbling block to my own party. However, no doubt my elder son will change all that, if they leave him anything to inherit.
When they are invited to a ball, Alex refuses to go, but Cara protests. Who knows how many more such balls there will be, she says. Much of the narration in Venice feels, once again, like Charles remembering a place that doesn't exist anymore. Not just because he has lost his youth, but also because he knows that if he went back to Venice now, it would be altered, made modern in 1,000 different ways, and he would feel each one like a wound. I think it's important to recognise that Charles is not saying that nothing ever lasts. Precisely the opposite. He feels like the world that he is remembering had lasted, that its values and traditions had stayed constant through centuries. He talks about a night at the Corombona Palace such as Byron might have known. This world was not some ephemeral thing that could be blown away by a strong wind. It had heft and history and many traditions which had great value, and its destruction was an event of seismic proportions. Ruinous. I'm certainly not saying that I believe that, but it's what Charles believes. And I'm assuming that it's what Evelyn Waugh believed. Let's move on to talk about the mentions of sexuality in this episode. In order to demonstrate to the viewers that Sebastian's father is a perceptive man, we are shown him figuring out Charles and Sebastian within hours of their arrival.
How was England when you left?
It's been lovely this summer.
Was it? Was it?
We're not shown any real reaction from him. There's no sense of disapproval, and equally no sense that Charles or Sebastian are trying to hide how they feel about each other. They go on to spend much of their time in Venice arm in arm. We see Cara watch them asleep in a gondola, draped across one another in an image that I see a lot in posts that people make about this show. Cara has a long speech about sexuality that feels to me less like a glimpse into her personal character and more like Waugh putting his own opinions into her mouth. The narrative does nothing to call her out or prove her wrong.
I think you're very fond of Sebastian.
Certainly.
I know of these romantic friendships of the English and the Germans. They're not Latin. I think they're very good, if they don't go on too long. It's a kind of love that comes to children before they know its meaning. In England, it comes a little later, when you're almost men. I think I like that. I think it's better to have this first kind of love for a boy than for a girl.
The idea that gay crushes are supposed to be just a phase that people go through is, of course, seen nowadays as a very dated view. But that's probably understandable in a book written over 80 years ago. Waugh certainly seems to recognise that some people don't grow out of it, although he does tend to treat them as disappointments. Charles will grow out of it, and will come to speak of Sebastian as a forerunner of his love for Julia. I fully recognise that much of the fandom would rather this was not the case. Far more people seem to ship Charles and Sebastian than ship Charles and Julia. For myself, I swing both ways on this issue, so I certainly won't be picking a side in these videos. Right now, in Venice, Charles only has eyes for Sebastian. His life has, after all, left him with little understanding of anyone but men.
I was completely ignorant of women and could not with any certainty recognize a prostitute in the streets. I was not, therefore, indifferent to the fact of living under the same roof as an adulterous couple, but I was old enough to hide my interest. Lord Marchmain's mistress, therefore, found me with a multitude of conflicting expectations about her, all of which were, for the moment, disappointed by her appearance.
I only have one theme left to address, and we'll be done. The final thing we need to talk about, of course, is drinking.
Wilcox welcomed our interest. We had bottles brought up from every bin, and it was during those tranquil evenings with Sebastian that I first made a real acquaintance with wine. Now for the... Ought we to be drunk every night?
Yes. I think we should.
Yes, I think we should too.
I hope Sebastian is seeing to the wine, says Bridie at the family dinner. Wilcox is out to be rather grudging when he's on his own. It's the first line we hear him utter, and drives home how oblivious he is to much of the world around him. "You're fond of wine?" he asks. "Very," says Charles. "I wish I were," says Bridie. "It's such a bond with other men. At Oxford I tried to get drunk once or twice, but I didn't enjoy it." I said last episode that I thought that it was possible to view Charles through the lens of the autistic spectrum. That goes double for Bridie. The "such a bond with other men" line sounds very much like someone figuring out human relationships like a puzzle that they don't have all the pieces for. Maybe that is one of the reasons why I am so fond of this show. Because I have always felt like that. I identify with Charles and Bridie. Later, in Venice, Cara plays her by that time well-established role of telling Charles things which are true, but which he might not want to admit.
Sebastian drinks too much.
I suppose we both do.
Oh, with you it doesn't matter. I've watched you together. With Sebastian, it's different. He'll become a drunkard if someone doesn't come to stop him. I've known so many. Alex was nearly a drunkard when I met him. It's in the blood. I see it in the way Sebastian drinks. It's not your way.
For those of us who are rewatching, who have seen this all before, Sebastian's drunkenness is the spectre at the feast. In an episode so full of beauty and of happiness, of innocence, his drinking foreshadows so much pain and tragedy that it casts a cloud for us. Like Charles, we want to remember this time, this summer, not the later times, not the bad times. We float through this episode, bobbing on a gondola, letting its poetry wash over us, drowning in honey.